Hello, welcome to the offline troubleshooting scenarios with the ArcGIS Android Runtime SDK. My name is Jose Bañuelos, and I'm part of the developer support product specialist here at Support Services. So for this presentation, I wanted to go into some of the offline sync issues we see here in Support Services, some of the common ones. And so I wanted to provide this presentation in hopes that it would help someone kind of avoid hours of research and testing while they're working with these offline workflows. And so I kind of narrowed it down to a handful of issues that we see. There's a lot more that would take some more time to get into, but for now, I'll do some quick errors and tutorials. So the errors so before we go into the actual errors and troubleshooting, I wanted to start off first this presentation with the concept of geodatabase replication. So for those working with offline um, workflows with the runtimes, may already be aware of this, but I just wanted to provide a quick summary before jumping into it. So first of all, geodatabase replication is copying data and distributing it between two or more geodatabases, and the data we're referring to could just be just a normal database. And so when we replicate this data, we can take part of that data and take that, and we're able to take that offline, kind of like collector, where we're able to choose a particular extent on the map where we would like to download, and we only get that data for that particular extent. Next, in order to have both um, replicas kind of match the same data, anytime there's a change in one, you would need to synchronize in order to for the data to match one another. And here with the ArcGIS Runtime SDKs, we use mobile geodatabases, which is the SQLite files containing this data for offline editing. And so in this presentation, I'm going to be referring it to the mobile geodatabase as a replica, just since it's a mouthful. I was thinking replica is easier to use. So the list of errors we're going to go through would be registering or sync failures, errors you would see when you have some issues with the network, some editing errors you may encounter while developing the application, and some issues that may be caused by the data itself and not the application. So the first error we're gonna see is an error you may encounter when registering or syncing. So here we're just gonna load the local replica that's already on the device, and we'll see the error message replica with this particular replica ID does not exist on the server. So this error message that we see, the reason why we receive the error where the replica ID does not exist on the server is because in this instance, I unregistered the replica from the REST endpoint of the service. So by unregistering the replica, I remove the link between the replica on the device and the data on the server. So the replica ID won't exist on the server anymore. And so you would also see a very similar error message replica with this GUID does not exist on the server. When attempting to register one of these replicas, and again, same thing, data was either accidentally removed or just no longer exists on the server. So what would be a way? So the steps we take here in support to kind of identify the issue is to check if the actual replica ID we're getting from the error message exists on the REST endpoint of the service. So we can go to the feature service and go to the replica's endpoint, and we can manually look through the list of replica IDs currently on the server and try to match it with the one we're seeing from the error message. However, we're not guaranteed of getting a particular replica ID. So the sample we're seeing in this presentation, I've added some error handling to kind of print out the error message with that particular replica ID. And so you wouldn't be able to see that, you might not see the replica ID every time when it fails. So one way to obtain the replica ID from the replica on the device would be to use the getSyncID method from the Geodatabase class of the Runtime SDK for Android. So this will allow you to obtain the replica ID, and now you can manually go into the service REST endpoint and then kind of look through it to see if it exists on the server. So next question is how, since as developers, we're trying to automate this and see how can we check if the replica exists on the server programmatically. So for now, there's a workflow where you would need to set up an HTTP request to first identify the replica ID that you have on the device. So first you would call it getSyncID, and once you have the ID, you can send an HTTP request to the REST endpoint of the service and see if it exists on the server programmatically. So here we have some sample code from the application we're seeing. And so this application, it's on GitHub, so I'm going to provide that at the end of the presentation so you guys can take a look at it in greater detail. But for basically just grabbing the ID we're getting from the getSyncID method, and then we're using that ID to construct the HTTP request. We once we return the data back, we parse the JSON being returned to look for the particular replica ID to see if it exists, and we'll know if it does or does not. And with this sample code we have here, I was using the Android Volley library, and of course, I feel free to use any preferred method of constructing an HTTP request from your Android application to do the same, but for this example, I used the Android Volley library. So we're moving on to the next issue. It's a network-caused sync failure. So this is a common error we see with the runtime and collector as well, which is built off our runtime SDKs, and that's when we're trying to do a sync as we load the data. There may be an interruption in the connection between the application and the server due to a faulty network connectivity. So in this case, in this demo, I simulated that failure by setting it to airplane mode, and the error message we're seeing is error while handling start sync geodatabase on the server. So this might be an error message you'll see, and now you'll know that it's coming from a poor network connection. So it's recommended that you're syncing in a location that has a stable network connection. So there may be a follow-up question as to what happens when there's a sync failure. So what happens to the data? Does it get lost? So the answer is it depends on the actual sync model that you're using. So if you're using a versioning workflow, the data is using per replica sync model. So if at any point there's a failure to sync the data, if like due to maybe a loss of network connection, then the versioned workflow has the rollback on failure operation available, where none of the data will be saved on the server. The data will still be stored on the local replica on the device. However, if you're using a non-version workflow, for instance, the archived workflow, it uses a per layer sync model, which means the layers are synced independently. So if, for example, we have 10 layers that we've edited and we get a sync failure halfway through the process. Let's say 5 of the layers were synced successfully. Well, the data, those edits for those 5 layers will be stored on the server. So those would be readily available on the server now, but the remaining edits for the remaining 5 layers that were not synced um, uh, would not show up on the server side. So then you would follow up with another sync, making sure you have a stable network connection, and then you'll see finally those edits on the second sync show up. And so here I have kind of a table demonstrating the rollback on failure operation. So when a versioned workflow, that operation is not available. So the next error we may encounter is when editing. And so this is more of an error you may encounter while developing your application. And so for this demo, we're just going to load the data and attempt to add a new point. And so in this example, we're getting an error where the data types are not compatible. So this is pretty much a straightforward error message. And again, there were some error handling code added just to make sure we capture this detailed error message. But it's pretty much self-explanatory. I purposely, in order to get this error message, hard-coded a string value in a field that was expecting an integer value. So it may be a common error sometimes, just making sure that the fields on the service match the input you expect the user to add in the application, to make sure those data types match. The next error we may encounter is a data cause sync failure. So from my experience, I've seen several instances where the developers were not responsible for creating the data and preparing it for offline use. It's sometimes handled by separate departments. So all the developer does is take the data and then set it up with the applications. And I wanted to provide this error because it'll help developers who may not have control over this data being provided to them and help narrow down some of these issues. So one of the errors we'll see is, well, we'll load the data, we'll add a new point, and then when we attempt to sync, we're going to get the following error. So the following error is, so a 400 request operation is not supported by this service. So again, error message is pretty detailed. The request operation not supported by the service. So in this instance, the error was caused by attempting to sync data to a service that was not sync enabled, a service that was not ready for offline editing. So one thing to look for is to check the service REST endpoint and search for the following 3 operations: the create replica, synchronize replica, and register replica. So these operations appear on the feature service operations when it can be taken offline, and it's published with the sync enabled capabilities. So an example, if you wanted to take a look at it, would be to use the following: sample server 6, which was used for this sample application as well, and you would be able to see these operations. So again, in this example, if you were trying to generate a replica from for instance, from the Android Runtime SDK, using the generate Geodatabase sync task, you would run into this issue if the service cannot be sync enabled. So that would be handled if publishing from desktop. On that end, prior to publishing, you would just add the global IDs and choose whether to use a version or archived workflow. So on that note, I wanted to share the sample app we were seeing in this presentation. So that's available on GitHub. So you can take a look at the source code with using the Volley and the Google Volley library to kind of send a request to check if the replica exists on the server side, and also allows you to see how adding a new point. So all the steps we saw in this presentation would be available on GitHub. So thank you guys for listening to the presentation. Again, my hope is to have helped at least one person kind of eliminate a few hours of troubleshooting or research to try to find out some of these offline editing issues that we here in support services encounter on a regular basis.